Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Well, thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with my colleague Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic with the U.S. Dairy Export Council and how it's working for our dairy producers. So welcome back to our podcast, Fred. And while you're online, why don't you introduce us to our invited guest from the U.S. Dairy Export Council?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. I was really excited when Krysta and her entourage said yes, they would be willing to be part of our podcast. The U.S. Dairy Export Council promoted Krysta Harden from Chief Operating Officer to President and CEO of USDEC in February of 21. She is only the third president and CEO to lead the organization since its founding by DMI in 1995 and is the first female executive officer. She directs a staff of dairy trade specialists, trade policy professionals, a global marketing team, and oversees 8 international offices working to facilitate dairy product and ingredient applications. Sounds like a lot going on. Let's start by giving us a little bit of background on USDEC and what it does and how it came about.
Well, thank you, Fred. I appreciate being part of your podcast. I'm always excited. It's delighted to be with you today. As you mentioned, USDEC was formed by some visionary farmers 27 years ago who recognized that we're a very efficient, productive industry in the U.S. and the U.S. dairy industry, and that the U.S. market is only so much it's going to grow. Our population is, kind of plateaued. It is what it is. And consumption, we're in, 95% of households in the U.S. So we had to think about markets elsewhere and knowing also, Fred, that there's great demand for dairy in the diet, not just in the U.S., but around the world in many, many countries who want and need the nutritious part of dairy in their diet. It's also delicious. They are underproducing. So we recognized there was opportunity, or these leaders did. And at that point, we were exporting around 2 to 4% of what we're producing. Today, it's a lot different story. It's closer to 20% of U.S. production. So we're definitely, as our efficient, farmers have produced more, we have been able to export more and become part of a global diet and not just domestically. So it's exciting. And just for the listeners to know that we have all dairy farmers participate in USDEC via the checkoff, because the DMI is our founding and largest supporter of U.S. Dairy Export Council. But we also have 117 companies, traders, cooperatives, processors that are our members as well. So we're working hand in hand between the farmers and the processors and exporters, traders, to make sure that doors are open and the groundwork is laid for U.S. dairy around the globe.
In your most recent blog, or not one of the most recent blogs, it stated that dairy exports rose 5% on the milk solids equivalent basis, driven mostly by whey and lactose with some help from butter and cheese. Help us understand what or who has driven this increase.
Well, there's a couple of things that are happening, I think, globally. One is recovery from COVID. Folks are coming back, to restaurants. They're, back in institutions and offices. And, it is a patchwork approach across the globe, frankly, but slowly but surely, I think we are coming out of recovery. There is demand. There's just growing demand for U.S. products. And at the same time, we're seeing our biggest competitors in the global market being the EU, European Union, and New Zealand, not having tight supplies themselves, and their ability to meet all of their needs. So in some markets, it depends on which ones, we're backfilling a little bit behind our competitors, but there is definitely demand for U.S. products. I think our industry learned that we need to diversify where we export to a couple of years ago, thank goodness, because we had been, Mexico was our number one market for years, and it's still our number one market and a very good friend and partner. But they had a really tough time during COVID. So the decision to open an office in Singapore that really focused on those 16 countries in Southeast Asia, our growing interest in South America. I just came back from Chile with a group of dairy farmers and processors talking to importers there, diversifying our outlook, Middle East, China, Korea, Japan, a number of markets where we are seeing growing opportunity and interest in our products and a variety of products. Kind of depends on the market.
Krysta, I was also reading that blog as well. You mentioned the relationship with Chile. Can you just talk a little bit more about that emerging market and maybe how you're developing that relationship?
Yeah, I'm very excited about Chile. I think it has great opportunity. We saw a big bounce and increase during COVID for our cheeses in Chile. It piqued really the interest of U.S. dairy farmers and our processor partners. So we were down there just last week. 6 farmers came from the U.S., led by our chairman, Larry Hancock from Texas, Marilyn Hershey, the chair of DMI, was with us, and other farmers across the country of all sizes, shapes, and forms. And the processors have a number of our member companies who were there for a trade show, a food trade show. We also had one-on-one meetings. We're trying to really step up our presence and visibility in Chile. We have a trade agreement with Chile, so it's the runway looks good for us to be in that country. They have the highest or second highest GDP in South America, 20 million people who have a disposable income, very interested in high quality, high value products, and specifically our cheeses. They do have a dairy industry in Chile. We met with farmers. We went on farms. We met with their processors. We're not about displacing any farmer. Or I always say this because as the daughter of farmers, it's near and dear to my heart to make sure that folks understand. In most cases, we're in countries where there is good dairy being produced and it is being used, but not enough to meet their growing consumer demand. And many countries just don't have the capability to expand or grow to meet that growing interest in their products. So we work hand in hand in many cases with local farmers and processors to increase demand for all of our goods. A lot of the dairy that's produced in Chile actually is for a fluid market for milk. So they don't have as much for processing cheese. And that's where, we can come in and help them. We're introducing them into new varieties. We have so many great cheeses in the U.S. So we were there doing taste tests. We were there working with importers. We were there talking to chefs, influencers, just in a range of interest in Chile about our great products. And I can tell you, interest was great. Really, really phenomenal visit, I think, to this country, both with the farmers, with the processors, with consumers, with chefs, with influencers, others who are really wanting retail markets. We want more SKUs in those markets, those big grocery stores and multi-use stores. We want to see our products there. So very exciting time for what might be happening in Chile and other countries, frankly, in South America.
One of the phrases that we will tend to hear from the media is free trade zones. What does that mean for dairy exports?
Well, frankly, it's not something we were able to take much advantage of. Free trade zones, not agreements, but zones. And I hope the listeners will pay attention to the differences. Free trade zones are mainly used in manufacturing, where a product goes in and can come out, an in-good or raw product goes into a country and is, shipped out in a manufactured product. We do not take advantage of that very much. We do have something similar with Canada, but it is different. And it is called the Import for Re-Export Program. And it's very unique to our relationship with Canada, where we send in milk, fluid, and it comes back to the U.S. under lower tariffs as yogurt or another product. But that is different from a free trade zone. So make sure everyone to realize the difference. What you do hear a lot about for dairy and agriculture in general is free trade agreements, FTAs, if you will. And that is when it's a negotiated, often bilateral, two countries. It can be multinational as well, talking about free trade, talking about lower tariffs, lower hurdles. to get into a market. I mentioned we have an FTA with Chile. We have one with Colombia, for instance, but we need more of them, Fred. That's something that has been lacking. It's been over 5-6 years since there's been a free trade agreement for U.S. agriculture. So we're continuing to talk to the administration about looking for new opportunities because our competitors are beating us to the punch. They're negotiating free trade agreements, unfortunately, quite common and quite often, and putting us at a disadvantage.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to explain those differences, Krysta. I think that really helps our listeners as we're visiting here today. And also just wanted to ask you how the impact of exports have on our producers' milk check. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about the value of that and how that gets added to their price per hundredweight.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a question I get a lot from farmers. The bottom line, what does it mean to me, right? And frankly, that varies farmer to farmer. So it's hard for me to talk about it in a general term to really, talk about what it's going to mean to an individual farmer without getting into some privacy issues and details. But what I can say is if we're exporting 18 to 20%, close to 20, not quite there percent of milk, what would happen if we didn't? How the prices would be if that much more milk and dairy products were on the market. So it would actually depress their checks without exports, without that very key market. That's the difference is really, if 1 in 6 tankers is going, out of the country, what if that was staying in the U.S.? So it's, looking at it a little differently than how you asked the question, Jennifer, but it's imperative for farmers, all farmers, no matter what region you're from, how big your farm is, who you're supplying, to think about if off the top, you had almost 20% more in just domestic market without markets outside our borders, how depressed that would make your milk check, how much we would have, what would happen to that milk, that additional milk, if it was not leaving the U.S. is the bigger question.
As I've watched the commodity markets in the last several months, it seems like there's certainly an effect with the U.S. dollar, the value of the U.S. dollar. How do you see that effect on our dairy exports?
Well, the U.S. dollar is strong, and that means that countries who are trying to purchase anything produced in the U.S., it costs more for them. So that does impact. I think all of us trying to export currency issues do vary, obviously, country to country. Some of them have fairly strong currencies themselves. Many of them don't, but it's their buying power, this impact when the dollar is so much stronger. So that has definitely been an issue in the marketplace. And of course, it ebbs and flows. There's cycles and these kinds of things, and we just kind of have to hold on and keep riding. But it definitely does is something comes to play when the dollar is so strong and other currencies are not at this point.
You mentioned, we really do have some strong exports. Nearly 20% of our milk is being exported. But do you see any potential challenges as we move into 2023 that would cause us to decrease?
I don't think we'll see the growth we did the last few years, large growth, 2 and 2.5% of exports. We really actually had very positive numbers during COVID and out of the first, of recovery. With our tight supply, and that's something we haven't talked a lot about, but supplies are tight. They're not only in the U.S., but worldwide. I mentioned New Zealand and Europe having tight supplies. So does the U.S. Everyone's being very cautious. Energy prices are up, feed prices are up, labor is up. There's a number of factors around the world, including in the U.S., that is limiting supply, and our farmers are being cautious, as they should, being very careful and making good business decisions for their own operations. But that does, limit supply for the world. And there is demand, there's great demand for, our products globally, as well as in the U.S., obviously. So I think we'll have growth in exports, but it will be more incremental. And we will see what happens with currency, with inflation. There's some of the issues. There's a lot of folks out there trying to predict. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to tell you my predictions, but, I don't think anybody really knows, but I hope my economists aren't listening because I depend on them greatly. But I do think we will see, incremental growth. Herd size will grow just a little bit. We'll have increased production. But not the great gains we made over the last couple of years, I would say, for 23.
Now, I'm going to take us into the weeds just a little bit. How does geographic naming of products limit dairy exports for those leaving the U.S.?
A lot of we call them GIs, and geographic indicators, Fred, and you're exactly right. It is down the weeds for most dairy farmers, but we need to be aware of them. And it really is a relationship that we have been pushing back on with the European Union. They claim many of the names, household names for cheeses that are produced around the world and certainly in the US and produced very well, that you can't use those names, and which puts it at a disadvantage for us, because the consumer walks into a store, they've grown up knowing they want feta, for instance. They think, does it only have to come from Greece? No, we have great feta here. We have great Parmigiana. We have great other cheeses that maybe has started in original production, but decades and decades later, we're producing the same types of cheeses here. So it's confusing when it's limited, when a consumer goes and says, oh, I want this because this is what I'm expecting. So that part has, we have really pushed back on the unfair trade of that. And while we're not getting free trade agreements around the world, the European Union is, and they're negotiating that language be included, that those words, those types of cheeses be protected, that can only be supplied by a European country depending on the type. That is one more hurdle, not a tariff, but really causing a very uncomfortable and unfair, we would say, positioning for U.S. products that are just as good, produced the same way, coming out of Iowa, coming out of Wisconsin, name the place. But the Europeans are protecting those names as a way to have a stronghold in certain markets. They're trying to do that in Chile right now. Even though we had a free trade agreement with no tariffs, they're trying to say, yeah, that's great, but the U.S. also can't bring in and use these same names. It's not just in dairy, just for listeners to know, wine also has these issues and other products. We work in a consortium, an organization that's pulled together, working against the misuse of geographic indicators. So again, it's not just dairy, although we're one of the, certainly industries that has some of the biggest complaints and issues with them.
In the last few years, the buzzword sustainability has been around as we talk about net zero initiatives and ways that dairy producers are being more sustainable in their practices. And just wondering if you could give our listeners a perspective on how the U.S. is positioned versus other countries supplying the world with dairy ingredients as it relates to sustainability efforts.
I'm happy to talk about it, Jennifer. In fact, I joined this industry a few years ago to help lead the global environmental strategy for U.S. dairy. I was so excited to see the kind of forward thinking, the progressive thinking, if you will, from the U.S. dairy industry, recognizing that we're not going to let others define who we are and what we do and how we do it. The farmers and the industry have set goals for 2050. It's a long runway because we need a long runway. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of research that's done, a lot of, answers to questions that farmers have on their own operations. They're doing so many things now because they're good business. They just make really good sense. How they use the water. Many of them have methane digesters. They're really careful on their energy use. So many different things. They're putting in cover crops. They're thinking about their feed. Some of them are actually using additives to lower methane. So many different things are happening farm to farm, really taking advantage of good technologies, innovation, good research and genetics and other areas. So already we are on the way to becoming net zero neutral. But what I would say is, the rest of the world is also stepping up. They have to as well, because it's a small world when you think about the multinationals who are sourcing not only from U.S. dairy, but from dairy productions around the world. They are the ones who are, listening to consumers. They're wanting to, keep them happy and keep them buying their products. So they come back to us as producing countries, with questions, with demands, with needs, with wants. So all of us, animal protein in particular, I believe, are being looked at or being scrutinized about our production. There's, obviously, animal care is another issue. Worker care is an issue, but sustainability is a common theme you hear as we talk about climate changes, we talk about extreme weather, however you want to define it. It really does raise these issues with consumers, the ultimate consumer, ultimate customer. I'm very proud, frankly, of where we are in U.S. dairy, this really embracing of we can do this ourselves. We don't have to be made to do it. In Europe, there's some really, really strict regulations and more to come for dairy production in that country. I believe that investments from our governments, investments from multinationals, investments from farmers themselves, a combination of how you leverage support, do the research, develop the technology, see how it can work on even the smallest farms, much less the big ones, but everybody should have access and know what it means for their operation. I have learned this in dairy from almost day one. No two dairies are alike, even neighbor to neighbor, sibling to sibling. They're all creative. They all do their own thing. They've got to look for what tools in that toolbox that work for them to help them be more sustainable. And that also means, and I mean this with all my heart, economically sustainable. They've got to stay on the farm. There should be, not the practices should not put them out of business, but help them be more efficient and productive. And at the same time, good for the environment. We always say we're good for people, we're good for community, and we're good for the planet. Dairy has a key role, and I believe sustainability is just part of it.
As we are recording this podcast, it's actually the first day of World Dairy Expo up at Madison, Wisconsin. Will we see you there? Will USDEC have a presence there?
Most definitely. I will be there. We have a great presence. A number of our farmers will be there, obviously. A number of our staff will be there. I've never gone before. It's been just about the whole time that I've worked in dairy. It's been either virtual or not happening or smaller. And so I'm excited. I've heard about it my whole career in agriculture. So I know I need to probably, pack my long underwear though, Fred and Jennifer, because I have thin Georgia blood. It'll be winter feeling for me in Madison, but we're excited to be there. We're excited to talk exports. I will be on a panel with some international partners end of the week. So I'm excited to learn, to share, but certainly to visit with everyone there. Maybe I'll see the both of you. That would be great.
Well, we sure hope you enjoy your experience at World Dairy Expo. It truly is a great way to see the breadth and diversity of our industry as we look at all sizes and shapes of our dairy industry there. And don't forget to get a grilled cheese while you're there as well. So that's one of my favorite things.
Well, at least one, right? You got,
At least one. I mean, I'm sure you could eat them for all 3 meals if you wanted to, but
that's comfort food.
I mean, that's not how you're supposed to do it when you're at Madison. I may have been doing it wrong all these years. As we wrap up, thank you, Krysta Harden and the team from USDEC for sharing information on this podcast. And I remind listeners that the podcasts are available on the ISU Dairy Team social media outlets, as well as wherever they get their podcast available. Jen and I look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views, and hopefully see you at World Dairy Expo.
Thank you.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.